We are very honored and pleased to have with us Professor Pankowski from Poland. He's actually here for literally 1 day. Yes. So he's coming in from Cambodia and flying tonight to Seoul. So it's so thank you very much and precious time. He's an expert on European neo-fascism, right-wing extremism. He has studied in Warsaw, and he is also very active in NGOs. Right? So he will talk all about that. What's probably also very interesting for you to hear is that last year he was a guest professor at the Center for European Studies. You have some kind of connection. And also he spent some time from Cambodia this summer. Right? So that would be very interesting for us to hear interesting parallels or similarities. So let's welcome him, and well, I'm sure it's a great presentation we will learn about.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for this kind introduction. Can you hear me okay now? I really appreciate this opportunity to be back in Bangkok, to be back at this wonderful university. I'm really happy and honored and very thankful to the organizers for this invitation. And please believe me, I didn't hesitate for a minute when I received the very kind invitation. I can tell you an anecdote, just to have a slow warm-up. I guess it happened to be the second time in my life when I got a really interesting invitation and I pretended I hesitated. When Barack Obama was in Poland in 2011 for the very first time, I had a phone call on Friday afternoon from the US Embassy in Warsaw, and they said, "Mr. Pankowski, do you have any plans for tomorrow?" And I said, "Oh yes, I may be meeting with my friends." But why? Why are you asking? And the lady was very polite, and she said, "Would you kindly possibly consider changing your plans? Because we would like to invite you to a meeting with President Obama." And I couldn't resist the joke, I admit, and I said, "I don't know, let me think, okay." And that is how I got to meet President Obama and had a short conversation with him the next day. So there are some proposals that you don't refuse, okay? And coming back to Chulalongkorn University was definitely one of those proposals, and I am so happy to see some familiar faces and also some new faces. I am really grateful for this opportunity. The subject is quite serious. It's not a subject that is normally associated with humor. It's not something that we normally joke about. It is a subject that is associated with serious issues, serious challenges, including violence, including hatred, hate speech. So I would say the subject in itself is serious enough. And therefore, maybe it is actually quite good to talk about it in a way that's not too serious, yes? Because anyway, we need to find a balance between the seriousness of the subject and the ability to discuss it in a free and open way. And that is very much what I hope to do today with your help, with your participation. And I'm sure, you know, all of us hear a lot of fixed, scripted speeches and presentations, and sometimes we give fixed, scripted speeches and presentations. I decided this is not exactly what I would like to do here. I would like to have a much more of an open-ended conversation, an open-ended discussion. There are many things that I am very happy to share with you, many things I'm again ready to talk about, but I would say a lot depends on your preferences and your interests. If there is something that you would like to raise in particular, let's do it. And I would encourage you to do so. I would encourage you very much to express your own opinions and comments and questions throughout this lecture, and I will try my best to have breaks for interactions and conversations as much as possible. Because if it is just me talking, of course that would be boring, especially for myself. So I very much hope that we can have a conversation, and I can also learn from you about your views, your opinions on the subject. Right-wing extremism in Europe is the title of this meeting, but of course we know this is not just a European problem. It is very much of a European problem, but it is a problem that goes beyond Europe. If you look at the United States, maybe Southeast Asia, we can find parallels and common challenges everywhere. So I say this because I believe it is this kind of subject where everybody has an opinion or could have an opinion which is legitimate, and it is important for the possibility of a dialogue, of a conversation. Now, before we get into the topic in terms of exemplifications, in terms of cases, normally, of course, we ask ourselves the question: what are we talking about? What are the definitions of the terms we are going to use? And as I think you know, and you are going to discover throughout your studies in social sciences, we need to be a little bit careful about definitions. Usually the definitions in social sciences are not too fixed. Yes? They have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Yes? They are approximations of reality, or what Max Weber called ideal types. Yes? They serve us as a kind of orientation signs in social reality, but they are never 100% reflections of the reality. And we have to accept it, we have to deal with it. And in addition to those so-called ideal types, there is something else called essentially contested concepts. There is one author in particular in Oxford who used to be my tutor, Michael Frieden, who wrote a lot about essentially contested concepts, which, in simple speak, means there are terms, especially political terms, that are always disputed. There is always disagreement about the meaning of the term, and the disagreement, the dispute about the meaning of the term, in a way, belongs to the nature of political discourse. So political discourse is always centered on the different interpretations of different terms. And those terms that we are going to touch upon today very much belong to this category of essentially contested concepts. So what are those essentially contested concepts? In this case, of course, right-wing extremism in Europe, which, if you notice, includes two concepts. It includes the concept of the right, the political right, the right wing, and the concept of extremism. Also very controversial. But there are also other related terms that also provoke a lot of discussions. Terms such as nationalism. It's one big term. We could have a long conversation about the different meanings of nationalism. Another term, which is even more charged historically, politically, and morally, fascism. One more term, even broader, even more ambiguous, even less easy to define, more difficult to define. Populism. It's a term we hear a lot, and not just in Europe, of course, but it's a term that provokes many discussions. So all those terms we need to treat cautiously, but we need to be aware of them. And we need to be aware of the different understandings of those terms, and we need to be aware of the fact that no definition will ever satisfy us fully, because that's not possible. So, coming back to the first distinction, right and left. As many of you will remember, this distinction in those two terms defining the spectrum, they go back to the times of the French Revolution, when those revolutionaries who were prepared for more radical actions were sitting on the left side of the Parliamentary Assembly. And those who were more moderate or conservative, we would say nowadays, they were seated on the right side of the Parliamentary Assembly. And this symbolic distinction has remained with us ever since. But of course the meaning of the distinction, of the cleavage, has evolved, has shifted in space. And of course, when we talk about left and right nowadays, nobody thinks about the French Revolution and who was sitting where in the French Assembly in the late 18th century. That would be ridiculous. Most people never even heard about it. But those terms, left and right, they very much stay with us. But the meaning of those terms has shifted. And especially in my region, where I come from, the region of the former communist bloc, those terms left and right are very fluid, even now. And some ideas and some policies that in the West are considered right-wing, in the east of Europe, they often belong to groups and political movements that call themselves left-wing, and vice versa. So there is a lot of confusion, a lot of ambiguity, if you like. But those terms still exist, and of course, in the broadest sense, the meaning that they got originally in France in the late 18th century is still relevant in the broadest possible sense. So the left-wing movements and ideas are sometimes referred to as progressive, and the right-wing ideas are referred to as conservative, as more aligned with the idea of social hierarchy, maybe more skeptic about the idea of democracy sometimes. If we talk about right-wing extremism, of course we are not just talking about the political right, but we are talking about an extreme version of right-wing ideology. Again, there are nuances and subtle differences also in Europe between different countries. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in Germany, for example, when we talk about the right, we usually or often think about right-wing extremism. But in many other countries, when we talk about the right and right-wing extremism, we usually talk about very different things. And of course, the German Christian Democrats and Angela Merkel are not right-wing extremists. But I think even they would hesitate to call themselves right-wing, precisely because of this sort of terminological minefield that is very sensitive. But okay, if we go beyond those subtle nuances and distinctions and differences between different European polities, we could say more broadly, there is a place for conservative ideas, which you can call right-wing ideas, in the broad democratic spectrum. So, for example, the conservative parties, Christian democratic parties, they have their place in the democratic spectrum in Europe. But right-wing extremism is something different. It is an extreme version of conservative ideas, but it is also something else. I would say it is a phenomenon that does not belong to the democratic spectrum. It is a phenomenon, a movement, an ideology that challenges the foundations of the democratic spectrum and the democratic system. So it is very much opposed to it, it is hostile to it, it is a threat, if you like, a challenge for the democratic system, for the democratic spectrum. It is outside of the democratic spectrum, traditional. Okay? And therefore, the democratic leaders, left and right, if they have something in common, for sure, it is the opposition to right-wing extremism as a threat to democracy. Well, this is the traditional picture. This is the kind of this is the kind of picture that until recently was true, I believe. More recently, it also becomes complicated because I believe the distinction between the democratic spectrum and the anti-democratic spectrum, especially right-wing extremism, it is becoming blurred. So the distinction between the conservative democratic right on the one hand and the anti-democratic extremist movements, it is becoming increasingly difficult. It is becoming increasingly problematic. And I believe we will come back to this issue also when we watch a video that I am talking to show you later today. But maybe just because this distinction is becoming more problematic, it is also becoming more important in our societies, in our politics. Okay, we will try to come back to it, but let me stress once again, just not to complicate things too much for starters. Okay, I believe right-wing extremism is the kind of ideology that is fundamentally opposed to democracy, democratic values, that challenges and rejects democracy as a system and as a set of values, usually in the name of an extreme form of nationalism. Okay? Which brings us to the second term, which, like I said, is even broader. There is a whole library of literature about nationalism, different definitions of nationalism, different understandings of nationalism. In the English language literature, nationalism is basically a neutral term. It describes those movements and ideologies that focus on the idea of the nation without judging them. Some of those movements that are centered around the idea of the nation can be progressive, some of them can be conservative, Some of them are democratic, some of them are not so democratic. But in academic literature in English, there is normally no value judgment attached to the term itself. Okay? Again, where I come from, it is a little different. In the case of Poland and maybe other countries in the region, when we actually talk about nationalism, we usually use it as a term to describe a phenomenon that is potentially dangerous. Why? I think it comes largely from the specific history of Central and Eastern Europe that is very much tainted by ethnic nationalism, by an aggressive form of nationalism, a form of nationalism which is directed against ethnic, religious, and other minorities. So it has played a very negative role in the history of Central and Eastern Europe. So I think in Central and Eastern Europe, when we talk about nationalism, we are more cautious, and we think nationalism as such is more of a negative term. But again, without going too deep for now into this vast library of definitions and interpretations of nationalism, I want to share with you one phrase that is paradoxical, but I think it is interesting and maybe provocative, but maybe also opening an interesting horizon when thinking about nationalism. It is a phrase coined by Ernest Gellner. I don't know if some of you might be familiar with his book under the title Nations and Nationalism. It's a small book, but very thought-provoking. I highly recommend it. And in this book, Gellner said, it is not nations that create nationalism, but it is nationalism that creates nations. So he took the concept upside down, if you like. And if you think about it, there's a lot of truth in that. If we look at the history of so many countries, so many nations, including countries in Europe, including Poland, including Germany, including other contemporary nation states, we will see that the nations did not exist in the same way that we are thinking of them now for much of the history until the modern times. In a way, the modern nation state is a creation of modernity. It is a concept that really became popular as a political idea in the 19th century. That's not so long ago. It's just 200 years ago. That's not that much if we look at the history of mankind. But nowadays, I think we often tend to think, normally we tend to think about humanity as divided into nations. I'm from Poland, you are from Thailand, he's from Germany. Yes? We think of humankind as composed of nations. It was not like that always. It is a relatively recent phenomenon. It is a relatively recent construct that really became so entrenched, so rooted in the everyday consciousness of people around the world, Western Europe, and also outside of Europe, that we don't even stop and think about it. And in a way, is this popularity, almost universal popularity of the idea of the nation is also giving fuel to the political movements that focus on the idea of the nation as a normal, natural category, as a central focus of political life. It is good to problematize what Michael Billig, one more author who is good to mention here, called everyday nationalism, or the banality of nationalism. As we think about sports, for example, through the concept of national teams representing the nations, and there are just so many everyday examples that Michael Billig and others list. But we have to stop and think and problematize the idea of the nation in our own minds. Why? Largely because this idea can be, like I said, from the experience of my region, can be dangerous if it expresses itself, for example, through ethno-nationalism, through an ethnic form of nationalism that excludes minorities, that excludes ethnic, religious and other minorities from the division of the imagined national community. And if we follow this line of thinking, this line of understanding nationalism, we could finally touch upon this very strongly charged term that is fascism, which in many ways you could call the most extreme form of nationalism. Yes. It is nationalism, especially ethnic nationalism, taken to its most extreme totalitarian potential. Again, it is an ideology that is focused on the most radical form of exclusion of minorities, national, religious, but also political, also ideological minority groups. Believe it or not, there are many definitions of fascism. There are many definitions of fascism. There is a lot of disagreement about what fascism actually means. There is a famous definition from 1934, which was a communist definition invented by Georgi Dimitrov, which I remembered recently when I saw Georgi Dimitrov's street in Phnom Penh. Of course, he was a Bulgarian communist, but he was active in Germany, so it's a well-known name in German history in the 30s. He said that fascism is an extreme form of the dictatorship of the capitalists. Historically, it is a definition that was important. It was used by many and believed by many. I think nowadays we would not really agree with this definition because it sounds a bit archaic. Yes, it sounds a bit old school, Marxist. It's not the best definition in my view. It's good to know it existed, but we should be probably critical about it. But there are many other definitions. There is another British academic whose name is Roger Griffin, who says fascism is the radical, holistic, palingenetic ideology of national rebellion. It's not the kind of wording that is immediately understandable to an average person in the street, okay? But it actually means something rather simple. Yes, it points to this aspect of fascist ideology which is all about the rebirth of the nation through a kind of apocalyptic event, through violence. And I think this definition is a little more convincing than the definition of Dimitrov. But by all means, it's not the only one. And guess what? I thought I could create my own definition of fascism. And I wrote a small book about it, which was published in Poland more than 20 years ago now, under the title Neo-Fascism in Europe, a study in ideology. And when I wrote this book, that was before the times of Twitter, unfortunately. Because nowadays the best book is the kind of book that you can summarize in one single tweet. Okay, that's how you become a famous academic. And that book could be summarized in one tweet. I can summarize it for you. You don't have to read it. I proposed my own definition of fascism as the politics of total cultural homogeneity. It's one of many possible definitions, but I think it's the best one. What I tried to say is basically what we already alluded to. So an extreme form of nationalism, understood as a vision of a uniform national culture. So let's say we have a country, we have a territory, and in the extreme nationalist, fascist vision, this one country, one territory must have one culture only. There is no place for diversity, there is no place for difference, there is no place for minorities, no place for other cultures, other religions, other languages, other political ideologies. It's a totalitarian vision. It is a vision of a total cultural homogeneity. And of course, if we look at the history of fascism, and especially the history of German fascism, Nazism, National Socialism, we will see the ideological drive led to a radical form of exclusion of all kinds of minorities, to the point of extermination, to the point of killing everybody who did not fit with the idea of total cultural homogeneity. The Jewish minority was among the main victims of Nazi ideology. Racially motivated discrimination and hatred. Also other minorities such as the Roma, also the gay people, also some of the religious minorities, they were also persecuted under the Nazis, and many of them died. And of course, the German version of fascism is the one that had the most tragic impact on European history. But there were also other similar movements with that ideology in other countries in Europe, with the ideology of total cultural homogeneity. And I'm afraid some similar movements exist in Europe and beyond Europe today as well. We will come back to those movements later on. But, you know, few of those contemporary political groups, political leaders, political activists would happily call themselves fascists or neo-fascists. It's precisely because of this tragic legacy of fascism, especially German fascism. There are some people who say, oh yes, we are fascists, full stop, but not many. But there are many who espouse, promote similar ideas, similar ideologies, a similar vision, which is not very far from the idea of total cultural homogeneity, without using the self-description of fascism. And you know, we have to call them something. Sometimes we call them right-wing extremists, yes, when they are clearly opposed to democracy. But many of those movements, and I think this is important, many of those movements don't declare their opposition to democracy as such. They use democracy in different ways, but sometimes they are very successful in using the democratic procedures by participating in elections, and sometimes with successes. And in those cases, we usually call them right-wing populists. That's another term that is making rounds in European Union. And it is, of course, broader, it is more general. Not everybody who is a right-wing populist is a right-wing extremist, and certainly not everybody who is a right-wing populist is a fascist. But in actual practice, those terms coexist, and sometimes they are, if not synonymous, you can find them next to each other. It is a kind of it is a kind of hodgepodge of terms that we have to deal with, and sometimes one term is more appropriate, sometimes it's another term. Sometimes the movements evolve, and if you look at France, for example, the National Front that was created by Jean-Marie Le Pen in the early 70s, in the beginning it was very clearly a fascist movement. There were people in the movement, the leading position in the movement, that were directly inspired by the fascism of the 1930s. Later on, the movement evolved. Recently, it changed its name. Now it is, as you know, probably led by the daughter of Jean-Marie, his name is Marine Le Pen. And I think it would be difficult to call it fascist without going into another discussion that is a bit complex, but it is safe to call it right-wing, which is more of a broad term. But like I said, populism is as a term is so broad, there is even less consensus on understanding the term populism. Some people would even say, well, what's wrong with populism? Populism means listening to the people, which, after all, is what democracy is about. There was a populist movement under this name, a populist part of the United States in the late 19th century that was quite a progressive movement, that was very different from those right-wing nationalist movements of the 21st century. So again, populism is not necessarily a negative term. Usually a kind of negative term when we use it nowadays, but it doesn't have to be so. Sometimes populism is understood as a label to describe the form rather than the contents of the campaigns. So, in simple terms, populist leader is somebody who is shouting a lot. Okay? The form, yes, it doesn't matter so much what he is shouting, but it is the style, yes. Using very simple language, sometimes crude language, sometimes brutal language, a language that connects with the mass of the people. That's one understanding. I remember when I was in Thailand last year, somebody told me, maybe in Thailand, populism is also a term that you hear a lot, usually to denote irresponsible economic policies. I thought that was a very interesting perspective, and I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Yes, and also in Europe, I think sometimes the term populism is used in that context. So we would call a populist a leader who promises something that's not necessarily easy to deliver or possible to deliver, especially in the economic sense, especially in the economic context. That's another possibility. But the most common understanding of populism is this. It is a kind of political rhetoric, a kind of political discourse, a kind of political ideology that is focused on the distinction between the so-called people and the so-called elite. And it presents itself to be on the side of the people against those who do not belong to this imagined community, which in actual practice is usually defined as the national community, and in actual practice populism means nationalism. But this is the kind of rhetoric that is, of course, very widespread in European politics, and not just European politics. And of course, Donald Trump would be the most obvious example of a successful populist leader. Somebody who shouts a lot, who uses brutal language, who is successful at presenting himself as a man of the people against the elites, despite being a millionaire. But I think there's something else, and that is the style. And again, somebody might say I am trivializing some serious issues, but like I said in the beginning, I think we need to have a distance sometimes, and maybe the distance helps us also to understand some things a little better. So I would say one of the important things about the populist appeal of Donald Trump, but also some other leaders, is his haircut. Doesn't seem obvious. I agree. But you will agree, you will accept that Donald Trump's haircut is a bit peculiar. It stands out. It's part of his personal brand, if you like. There is a Dutch politician who made his name as an anti-Muslim campaigner. Wilders is his name. And he's a populist leader that is a little less successful recently, but he used to be a very influential politician of the populist wave in the Netherlands. And I remember attending an academic seminar in Amsterdam about populism, right-wing populism, and we discussed this Dutch case. And I asked this cheeky question to the Dutch presenter about the haircut of the leader. And he said, he was very much surprised. And he said, "Oh, thank you so much for asking me this question. I believe it is very important. Nobody asked me this question before." If you look at Wilders' haircut, it's a bit like Donald Trump. It's blonde. And the Dutch friend of mine said, yes, he actually used his haircut as his personal brand that made him different from all the other politicians. And when you try to present yourself as different from all the other members of the political elite, having a funny haircut can actually help you. Okay? this is maybe a trivial example, but I think it says something about populism as a style, not just as an ideology. I can give you another story. There is a book under the title Populism, a well-known book written by Paul Taggart, which basically gives this population gives this definition of populism. Excuse me, that I already mentioned. Populism as an ideology that constructs the distinction between the people and the elite. Okay, but he also quoted an American populist leader from the late 60s, early 70s. His name was Wallace. He was asked, this American politician was asked, what is populism in your opinion? You are described as a populist. What is populism to you? And he gave this answer. Populism, for me, is catch up with everything. Very strange. Not a political answer at all, okay? But when I got this book and I had to write a review for the International Journal of Sociology, I thought, this is a great book. And I built my review around it, as you know, using Bourdieu and the politics of taste and Stuart Hall, cultural studies theory. So I wrote a review starting from this quote about populism as not just a political movement, but also a kind of cultural style. And many years later, I met Paul Taggart. Actually, it was the same seminar in Amsterdam I already mentioned. And I said, well, Paul Taggart, you are the author of this book. I read your book many years ago. It was wonderful. I wrote a review. And this quote from George Wallace, catch up on everything, that's fantastic. And Paul Taggart said, really, it wasn't in my book. I don't remember. I don't remember this quote. But I really think that was a great quote that helps us understand populism as something much more than a political movement or a political ideology. And 1 or 2 years after this conversation with Paul Taggart, I was again thinking about this semi-serious definition of populism. Yes, catch up on everything is the kind of taste, yes, of everyday American food. Yes, it's what average people in America eat. Whatever they eat, they will catch up on it. Yes, and this is part of the identity of average Americans, especially in the South. In the southern states. I was in Montgomery, Alabama, which is a small town, but historically important. You know, the history of Martin Luther King and his rights. And I went into a local museum, and they had a T-shirt with a list of things typical for the local identity of Alabama, like country music, you name it. And one of the things on the T-shirt was, guess what? Catch up on everything. I was speechless. I was puzzled. I thought, oh my God, this is the quote that I was thinking about. And that helped me understand where the phrase came from. So it was not just Paul Taggart quoting George Wallace in his book, but it was George Wallace quoting from a local tradition of Alabama. And of course, that was a clever political statement, presenting the leader as belonging to this everyday culture of ordinary taste. So I hope this anecdote might help us understand populism is a lot more than politics. It can be a way of connecting with the people by leaders through non-political references. And I think partly that is the reason why populism is becoming a successful and a successful tool for political leaders today, and not just in Europe. When it becomes dangerous, of course, it's not when they talk about ketchup. It is not when they have funny haircuts. Populism becomes problematic when it becomes connected with radical forms of exclusion, with radical forms of nationalism, and when it is influenced by the kind of political discourse that used to be reserved for right-wing extremists. So it is a certain paradox we can talk about. On the one hand, populism is a very democratic form of connecting with the mass of the people, and it can also be influenced by an anti-democratic exclusionary ideology that is opposed to the very fundamental, very important democratic values. And so this is the kind of paradox that we see in America today, that we see in Europe today, and possibly in other regions. Okay, I'm looking at the watch. Are there any comments or questions at this stage? Of course, we just touched upon many different things, so we could have a long conversation about each of those different terms. But it's good. We could and we should have a conversation, because none of those definitions is complete, none of those terms have a fixed meaning. Yes, please go ahead.
Just to comment, to ask you to speak up, please. Just speak up.
Speak up. Oh, well, sorry. I thought that was already too loud, and I tried to limit my volume. I will try to improve. Thank you. I will try not to be a populist who shouts too loud, but I have to find a balance. So thank you for this remark. Please.
You were saying that the nation is the creation of the 19th century. Can you give us a little bit more, like what gave the rise of this, necessity of creating the nation in this century, like the major one at least?
Oh dear. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That is definitely an important question that, as you can imagine, is debated a lot. But I would say there are two main schools of thought, broadly speaking. One is the school represented by the author I quoted, Ernest Gellner, but also others. And you could call them the modernists or the constructivists in terms of interpreting the spread of the idea of the nation in the 19th century and later. The other school is represented by people such as Anthony Smith, for example. Also other authors such as Karol Modzelewski, the Polish historian. They are called ethno-symbolists. Basically, the main difference between them is the following. The modernists or the constructivists, they really emphasize the nation as a creation of the modern times. I would hesitate to say it's an artificial creation, but in a way it is. It is what they are saying. Yes, they say the nation is a construct of the modern times. It didn't really exist before. Of course, there were states, there were kingdoms or republics or other forms of statehood and other forms of hierarchy and other forms of social and political life. But the idea of the modern nation is quite new, and it was created in the 19th century, or it took off in the 19th century, mostly through the process of industrialization, or in connection with the process of industrialization or economic modernization. So basically, what they are saying, people like the late Ernest Gellner and other constructivists, modernists, what they are saying is that the modern economy, the industrial economy, developed, and it required a new kind of labor force that would be able to communicate in a way that was simple. So again, if we look at one territory, yes, traditionally there would be 100 dialects and local cultures and customs, and it would be a very diverse picture. But if you put a factory here and here and here, and there is a rapid pace of economic development, economic modernization, and economic interactions, then the participants of those economic interactions, according to this model, need to communicate easily. So they need to speak a language that is common. If they come from 100 different cultures, it is difficult. So you need a school system to teach them one common language. But the school system needs some contents to teach. So you need literature, you need a codified form of language as well. Yes, that is common. You need also a certain set of common values that is built often on the foundation of the modern nation, the idea of the modern nation. Of course, this kind of nationalism that results from economic modernization does not automatically have to be hostile to any form of cultural difference. Does not automatically lead to discrimination or extermination. But according to Gellner and other authors that we call modernists or constructivists, this element of industrialization and economic modernization goes hand in hand with the nationalization of society. And nationalization of society is not just something that happens by itself, but importantly, it happens through state policy and through the activity of national movements. Certain forms of national culture are influenced, or dare I say, constructed by those nationalist movements. I will never forget the conversation I had when I was in England, and I talked with a Slovak friend of mine who asked me who invented the Polish language. I remember my surprise. I thought, nobody invented by itself, naturally. But he said, no, no, there must be a person who invented it. I didn't understand this question at the time. It took me many years to understand it. In a way, he was right. In the case of Slovakia and many other countries, there was a moment when somebody had to sit down and say, well, okay, we take this word from this local dialect, we take that term or that phrase from that dialect, yes, this is the book, this is the codified version of the Slovak language. But of course, in Polish history, it was not so very different. There was also another person, his name was Lindbergh, who also wrote the first dictionary of the Polish language, on the basis, of course, of the language and dialects that existed previously, yes. But that is an example, yes. So there is a political decision to create, to build national culture on the basis of already existing elements of culture. Okay? Sorry, I don't forget. Please bear with me. Yes, let me just mention something about the other school, the ethno-symbolists. So they say, yes, okay, a modern form of the nation, of course, is related to modernization and social and economic processes, but it does not appear out of nothing. Yeah? So they say, okay, there is an element of political decision here, and somebody sits down and writes a dictionary, and then maybe this dictionary is used in schools in a certain territory. But this dictionary is not just invented by someone out of nothing, yes, it is still based on elements of culture that existed previously. So the ethno-symbolists would say, yes, the modern nation is a modern phenomenon, but it is not completely artificial because it is still based on some cultural reality that existed before, on certain ideas, on certain elements of common heritage, often religious heritage, etc., etc. So I would say maybe the main difference between those two schools is a difference on emphasis. The ethno-symbolists, they don't question the main conclusions of the constructivists, but they are less radical in the conclusions. I hope that's clear enough. Yes, we are talking about complex ideas and complex issues at the risk of oversimplifying them. But I think overcomplicated can be just as dangerous as oversimplifying sometimes. So it's a question of balance. Sorry, I'm again not speaking loud enough. Okay. Sorry, you wanted to say something, please.
So then again, would you also argue that nationalism is basically an invention by the elites, or?
Well, that's a really good question.
Because it sounds like it's in their interest, because initialization was mainly put there by the elites because they wanted to make more and more profit. So to me, it would seem like it would be in their interest to invent nationalism.
Thank you very much. I think that is a really good question, which of course very much goes against the self-perception of nationalism and the nationalists. Yes, I have never heard of a nationalist who said, "Oh, let's create a nation so we can exploit people better." Yes, I don't think in most cases there is a conscious strategy like that. But I suppose in reality it is very much what you are describing. Yes? But of course, the discourse of nationalism, and especially the discourse of nationalist populism, is the opposite. So the nationalists, especially the populist nationalists, also the ethno-nationalists, they would say, yeah, we represent the culture of the ordinary people. Again, and we are against, often they would say, against the cosmopolitan elite. We represent the ordinary man with his ketchup, okay, with his everyday culture and values. in opposition to the elite that is often perceived as a kind of international cosmopolitan conspiracy against the ordinary people. That is the populist discourse, the nationalist populist discourse that we know so well. And probably this is at the heart of the paradox of nationalist populism nowadays, since it in some ways it serves elite interests by using the discourse of the interest of the common people against the elites. Again, you know, I cannot think of a better example than Donald Trump, yes, who presents himself as a man of the people, an enemy of the elites, by being very much from the elite of New York City. But as we can see, it is possible, and historically it has been possible for political movements, for nationalist movements, to be created or influenced by the elites, while using an anti-elite discourse. So, thank you for this question. I think it's important. Please. Sorry if I said something wrong about Slovakia, and I don't remember the name of the person who wrote the dictionary. Maybe you can
I love the
correct me.
question because Slovak history and nationalism based on it's really connected to the language at the time, right? And I wanted to say that it's interesting actually to look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the region if someone wants to study nationalism, because you can see many of the differences, how to define the term, because many of those movements started or were like evolved from different reasons and from different sources. For example, Slovak nationalism was led by priests because that's only the priests who be educated. They were educated, for example, abroad. They were educated, for example, in Czech language. So they were even divided between those who believe there is a Czechoslovak nation or those who believe there should be a Slovak nation, which later on led to a conflict during the first Czechoslovakia, which happened to be helpful for Adolf Hitler to separate Czechoslovakia and create Slovak fascist satellite state and completely kind of take the Czech lands, right? So for me, nationalism, nothing constant. It's very fluid and changes during the course of history. And nowadays we can see the nationalism and the history of nationalism, which in many countries, as Jelmer said, that created nation is hijacked by populists and politicians because it's easier to control. If you feel it hijacks the sense of belonging, the need of belonging for people, because we want to belong somewhere. So you see, and it's very nice to study immigration and how immigrants feel more connected to traditions of the country they don't live in, because they need that sense of belonging when they feel alienated in the part of the country they are currently living. So sometimes you feel that more nationalist people are those who don't live in the country, right? More racist people are those who never met foreigners or other people, right? It's the sense of belonging which is hijacked. That's why I believe that we really cannot define nationalism like very like a general term. We always need to look at a particular time in the history and particular society and the history of the society. That's why it's so hard to talk about. Thank you for the language, because yeah, that's something which is funny, because if I talk to some people in my country who are very like proud, they would never admit that we are kind of artificially created country. At that time, people were not thinking about themselves as Slovaks. They belonged to Austro-Hungarian Empire. They knew about the king. The newspapers was not delivered. Many times it was in Hungarian language because people were kind of assimilated during the actually end of the 19th century movements. So they didn't think about themselves as Slovaks. It was actually the intellectuals which that time was the elite, because Slovaks didn't have bourgeois, are very like, they were not very elite or kind of rich people who were representative of the Slovaks. They considered themselves as Hungarians. So it was actually the intellectuals trying to create this movement to like anti-Hungarian assimilation. And at the same time, part of them wanted to kind of integrate themselves with Hungarian, create nations which would be more like liberal and this kind of more culture diverse, right? So even there they were not homogeneous, which says a lot. mostly nationalism in the nation was about which party won the battle. That's at the end of the day. So just that's not. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and I really appreciate the example of Slovakia, which in a way I think could be used as a kind of window to the broader problematic of nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe. Again, I hesitate to say those nations were created artificially, because I think that would be taking it too far. But, like you said, the so-called national consciousness is not eternal. It did not exist until a certain point in time. And you know, even in the 20th century, in Poland, when there was a census of the population that tried to define the population in national terms, there was a big percentage of the inhabitants of Poland in the 20th century who, when they were asked about their nationality or ethnicity, depending how you translate this term in English, narodowość in Polish, they said, oh, local. They didn't say Polish, they didn't say Ukrainian or Slovak or whatever. They said local. They did not define themselves in national terms. And I think in a way that was very normal for hundreds of years, and not just in the region of Central Europe. It was normal for people and for communities not to define themselves in national terms, because those national categories are modern categories, which are in many cases imposed from above on the community or on the individual. Before we go into other topics, let me mention, since that seems to have provoked some interest. Let me mention one more example, which is one of my favorite examples, showing how those categories can be problematic in the context of European history, especially Central European history. There were three brothers in the first half of the 20th century, living in Eastern Europe. Well, all of them were born in the territory of what at that time was the Russian Empire, the western side of the Russian Empire. Ivanovsky was their family name. Each of them became a famous, respected writer, intellectual, and a political leader. They all had the same father and the same mother, raised in the same household, but each of them went in a different way and joined a different national movement. And one of them nowadays is known as a famous Polish intellectual. One of them is known as a famous Lithuanian intellectual, and one of them is a famous Belarusian intellectual and leader. Yes. According to the simplistic nationalistic vision of humankind, that's impossible, okay? Because we are born as Polish or Slovak or German or whatever, and we die as Polish, Slovak, German, and whatever, depending on who were our parents. But the case of the Ivanovsky family shows that's not like that. Yes, and in the history of Central and Eastern Europe, there was a moment when those national categories were very much fluid, like you said. Yes? In some cases, they can be fluid even now, or maybe they can be more fluid again in the 21st century. Who knows? With postmodernity. Etc. But that's another discussion. But there is okay. I just want to say one or two other things about the emergence of national identity. Has anybody here visited the Siam Museum in Bangkok? Yes, at least some of you. If you haven't visited, I would highly recommend. It's one of the best museums I have ever been to when it comes to this issue, when it comes to showing how national identity is forged through different social, cultural, and also political processes. Yes, and it's not for me to tell you about the history of Thailand because you know it much better, of course. But I think if you go to that museum, you will see that some of the processes that we know from Central and Eastern Europe are parallels in Southeast Asia, sometimes around the same times. Yes, and how Thai national identity was constructed and reconstructed on the basis of existing elements of culture and heritage. I have to say that was really a fascinating discovery to me, and the parallels are often striking. Okay, one last point on the idea of the construction of identity, which is really important in a way. We talked about nationalism that creates the nation, but there is one other thing that is related, where I think the process is similar. We could also talk about racism that constructs the race, and you have to stop me at some point. I wrote my PhD on this topic, so I can go on and on about how race is constructed. But I think it is not so very different, in fact, which is also paradoxical, because we often think the idea of race is very obvious, and it is biologically rooted. Yes? What can be more obvious than the difference between black and white? We think it is a biological difference. In fact, it is not. And it is also the kind of category, the kind of label that changed over time, over centuries, and over space. If you look at ancient Egypt, the understanding of the cultural associations of skin pigmentation were different, and then they changed, and they changed again. And there is a long history of colonialism, of course, that influenced the perceptions of so-called blackness and so-called whiteness. There is a long history that we can sum up as the history of fluidity of those categories. And nowadays, when social scientists talk about race, they usually write about race. They write the word race in inverted commas, showing a distance to the term. So race is a socially constructed phenomenon. It is a construct. It is not an element of objective biological reality, despite the common misconceptions, or despite the common interpretation of race as rooted in objective reality. Okay, it is probably a good idea to have a short break now. I really appreciate all the comments. I hope we can come back to this discussion later on. But like I said, I also hope to move on to some other topics. But I'm thankful for the conversation so far, and I would like to encourage you to continue in 2, 3, 4 minutes. Okay, thank you.